How do you know what's real when someone keeps rearranging the truth? One day you remember what was said the exact words, the way it made your stomach twist, but hours later, you're told it didn't happen like that. You're told you misunderstood, that you always overreact, that your memory is unreliable. So you question yourself, you second guess your feelings, you start rewriting your own story just to survive someone else's version of it. That's not just confusion, that's control disguised as concern cloaked in kindness, delivered in soft, careful syllables. Gaslighting isn't always violent. Often it's gentle. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It tiptoes into your mind and rearranges the furniture while you sleep. And by the time you wake up, nothing feels quite like home anymore. You begin to distrust the very instrument you use to navigate the world, your perception. You begin to ask permission to feel. You begin to apologize for remembering. But here's the quiet rebellion, asking why. Not of them, but of yourself. Why do I feel this way? Why does the truth keep slipping through my fingers? What if the confusion isn't a flaw, but a symptom? What if the fog isn't in your mind, but around it? Tonight, we're not going to diagnose anyone. We're not pointing fingers. This isn't about blame. It's about light in the ways it's bent fractured and sometimes used as a weapon. This is a soft unraveling of how control can feel like love and how survival can mimic obedience. If any of this feels familiar, if it touches a part of you that you don't quite have words for yet, then you're not alone. Like and subscribe if this feels like home. And tell me in the comments, what thought keeps you up at night? There's a specific kind of tired that comes from constantly questioning what you once trusted without hesitation. It doesn't feel like ordinary fatigue. It's quieter than that, like a flickering hallway light sputtering just when you need it most. One moment you're certain, the next, you're adrift. You replay conversations in your mind, not because they mattered, but because they were rewritten. You rehearse your feelings before expressing them, wondering if they'll be used against you, twisted into something else. And over time, you become your own censor. You become the editor of your own story trimming parts that might provoke correction, muting parts that once held color. This is the internal landscape of gaslighting, not just being lied to, but being gently, persistently trained to doubt the light inside you. It's not always dramatic. It often begins in small moments. You recall saying something and the other person looks at you calmly and replies, "You never said that." A chill runs down your spine. Did I forget? Did I imagine it? Or are they just that confident in their version? The candle flares, then dims. The real power of manipulation doesn't come from domination. It comes from subtlety, from being just convincing enough that you begin to abandon your own memory. And the moment you hesitate, the moment you say, maybe you're right, something inside you dims. Not your intelligence, not your value, but your certainty. The inner compass that once pointed true starts to spin not wildly, but quietly. And that quiet spinning is the most dangerous kind because it doesn't cause panic. It causes surrender. You begin to lean on their reality, their interpretation, their framing. You begin to crave their approval to validate your version of events. You begin to need them, the very person undoing you. There's a soft question that lives at the center of this experience. What is truth if it can be moved by someone else's mood? You might know logically that facts exist, that memory has shape. But in the hands of a gaslighter, even truth becomes elastic. They don't always erase the truth. Sometimes they just stretch it until it snaps. You're remembering it wrong, they say. Or, you always do this. And those words echo. Not because they're louder than yours, but because they've convinced you your voice is unreliable. Jung wrote about the confrontation with the shadow, that dark part of the psyche that hides what we cannot accept about ourselves or the world. But in gaslighting, someone else takes control of your shadow. They cast it for you. And they make you believe that your fear, your doubt, your sensitivity is all that you are. And because you've been subtly convinced that you're too much, too emotional, too dramatic, too forgetful, you retreat. You begin to dim yourself so you don't provoke distortion. But here's the cruel twist. The more you adapt to avoid conflict, the more you lose your edges, your clarity, your spine. And yet, there's still a whisper in you that knows something isn't right. That whisper is important. It's a relic of your original knowing, your inner flame, flickering but not gone. It shows up in the tension in your jaw when someone denies what you remember. It shows up in the unease you feel when you're told you're too sensitive even though your feelings make sense. It shows up in the questions you ask yourself at 2 a.m., wondering why you're the one unraveling when someone else holds the scissors. A candle is a delicate thing. It doesn't scream when it's blown out, but it leaves behind the smell of smoke, the trace of something that once held light. That trace is your intuition. It doesn't need to shout, it just needs space. And the first act of reclaiming your certainty is not to confront the gaslighter, it's to create space where your flame can breathe again. That may look like silence, or solitude, or journaling, or speaking with someone who believes you the first time, not because you need permission, but because you're tired of fighting invisible battles. The paradox of gaslighting is that it makes you question your own experience while simultaneously needing your compliance to succeed. Without your participation, it cannot function. And that's where your power begins to return. Not all at once, not with confrontation, but with quiet refusal, a gentle decision to hold your version of truth, even if no one validates it yet. That's the beginning of relighting the candle. And maybe in some still part of the night, you begin to ask, what would it feel like to trust myself again? You don't need to know the answer yet. Just let the question rise, like smoke, like memory, like light. Gaslighting doesn't begin with a blatant lie. It begins with a suggestion, a subtle, almost invisible twist of reality, a hesitation in the voice, a tilt of the head, a small correction that seems harmless at first. That's not what I said. Or, you must be confused. These aren't violent statements. They're soft, polite even. But behind their calm surface lies something more strategic, the slow dismantling of your inner compass. Over time, those small suggestions accumulate like sediment layering over your sense of clarity until you can no longer see through the fog. What makes gaslighting so destructive isn't just that it distorts truth, it reprograms the way you interpret reality itself. It replaces evidence with emotion. It substitutes memory with suggestion. And it rewards you for compliance while quietly punishing resistance. There is a reason this form of manipulation works so well. It taps into basic ego defenses that all of us rely on to make sense of the world. Denial, projection, repression. These aren't flaws. They're survival strategies. The gaslighter simply learns to weaponize them. When they deny your reality, they're not just disagreeing. They are placing your memory in opposition to their certainty and doing so with such emotional calm that it seems rational. You're overreacting. You always take things the wrong way. These phrases slip into the bloodstream of a relationship like a sedative. They make you question not only what happened, but who you are for remembering it. The more this happens, the more likely you are to internalize it. You begin to identify with the distortion. You don't just think you made a mistake. You begin to believe you're someone who always gets things wrong. It's no longer just that you missed something, it's that you're incapable of truly seeing clearly. And this belief is what keeps you tethered. Because once your perception has been undermined, you need theirs to orient yourself. That's the quiet genius of gaslighting. It creates dependency by making your truth unstable. Jung might say, this is where the shadow takes over. The parts of yourself you suppress, your doubt, your anger, your pain, become the only parts visible to the manipulator. And because you've spent so much energy hiding those parts, you assume they must be right. If they see me as unstable, you think maybe I am. But the truth is, the gaslighter doesn't see the real you. They see what serves their control. And they reinforce that version over and over until even you forget there was ever a different one. One of the most insidious tools in the gaslighter's kit is projection, accusing you of the very behavior they're exhibiting. They'll say you're being manipulative when you ask for clarity. They'll call you selfish when you express your needs. It's a sleight of hand, a psychological redirection. And in your effort to defend yourself, you stop asking the original question. You become so focused on proving you're not the villain, you forget you were the one being hurt. It's like being in a hall of mirrors. Every time you reach for truth, you just find another reflection, warped and endless. Another tactic, rewriting history. You recall a painful moment, something that left a mark, but when you bring it up, they deny it ever happened. Or they insist it was a joke. Or worse, they say it was your fault. And because the moment lives in your body, but not in their story, you begin to wonder which version is real. That doubt is what erodes you. Not just because it hurts, but because it isolates. You stop sharing your reality with others. Out of fear, they'll mirror the same disbelief. And so the gaslighter becomes the only voice in the room, the narrator of your life. Symbolically, it's like a mirror that's fogged from the inside. No matter how many times you wipe it, your reflection never quite returns. The distortion isn't external, it's seated within. And that's what makes it so difficult to name, so difficult to resist. Because it's no longer about what someone is doing to you. It's about what you've been taught to do to yourself. You question your instincts, you mute your intuition, you double-check your reality with someone who benefits from your uncertainty. And yet, something in you still knows. Beneath the fog, there's a memory of clarity, a sensation of truth, a body-level understanding that this isn't how it's supposed to feel. That knowledge may not yet be loud, but it's ancient. It lives in the tension behind your eyes, in the tightening of your chest, in the exhaustion of pretending to be okay. It lives in the ache that comes from constantly explaining yourself to someone who never seems to hear you. That ache is not weakness. It's the residue of truth trying to surface. So you ask softly, what would it mean to believe yourself again, to sit with your version, incomplete, emotional, imperfect, and still treat it as valid? That's not selfish. That's not dramatic. That's the beginning of reassembly, of healing from a manipulation that taught you to shrink, that taught you to silence yourself for the sake of someone else's comfort, that taught you to erase your truth in exchange for belonging. But you're allowed to return to yourself slowly, gently, without needing anyone's permission, without needing perfect evidence. You are not a mirror to be fogged. You are a window, and the light was always yours. Somewhere beneath all the logic and explanation, beneath the analysis and the careful mapping of manipulation, there is a child. Small, watchful, loyal beyond comprehension. A child who once learned that love was conditional, that to be accepted, they had to stay quiet. To be safe, they had to agree. That survival required adaptation, not truth. This is the part of you that doesn't just endure gaslighting, it clings to it. Not because it's weak, but because it learned long ago that staying close to danger sometimes felt safer than being alone. And so when someone rewrites your story, this inner child doesn't resist. They try to become the version that's acceptable. They offer flowers to a shadow, hoping that maybe this time love won't hurt. Won't. It's easy from the outside to ask, why don't they just leave? But that question misses the depth of the bond. Gaslighting isn't just a cognitive manipulation, it's an emotional fusion. It creates something that psychologists now call trauma, bonding, a deep, almost unbreakable attachment formed through cycles of abuse and reconciliation. Pain, then comfort, humiliation, then affection. Each cycle reinforces the idea that the only way out is through the gaslighter's approval. And for the inner child, this pattern feels hauntingly familiar. It mirrors the earliest moments of emotional survival. Gabor Maté explains that a child will choose attachment over authenticity every time, because being connected even to someone who distorts you feels safer than being alone in truth. And so the child in you doesn't resist the gaslighter. They work harder to be good, to be agreeable, to not make things worse, and in doing so, they slowly disappear. Not because they're gone, but because they've gone quiet, waiting for the moment when it's finally safe to be seen again. But that safety never fully arrives, because gaslighting isn't about love, it's about control disguised as care. And yet, the child in you keeps hoping, keeps waiting, because they believe with all the innocence they once had that if they can just get it right, the pain will stop. They don't realize the pain isn't coming from them. It's being reflected onto them. But how could they know? They're too busy trying to earn what should have been given freely. There's a paradox here that aches the more you adapt to the gaslighter's world, the more they reward you. But the more you adapt, the more lost you feel. This isn't just emotional confusion, it's identity erosion. The child in you starts to wonder, who am I when I'm not trying to be accepted? And if you've spent years or even decades shape-shifting to survive, that question can feel terrifying. Because you don't just fear being rejected, you fear being invisible. And yet, that child still remembers. Somewhere deep in your bones, you remember what it felt like to be yourself without fear. Before you were edited, before you were told your feelings were too much, before someone made you doubt your own heart, that memory may not be clear. It may come in dreams or in the way your chest tightens when someone gaslights you again, but it's there. A quiet pulse beneath the distortion, the original rhythm of who you were. In therapy, this part of you is often called the inner child, but it's more than a metaphor. It's a living thread inside your psyche, carrying every unmet need, every silenced emotion, every abandoned truth. And when you find yourself stuck in a loop of manipulation, it's often because this part of you still believes the gaslighter is the parent, the savior, the one who gets to decide your worth. And so you stay, you explain, you forgive. Not because you don't know better, but because the child in you is still waiting for the love they never received. Imagine for a moment that child standing in front of you, wide-eyed, hands clenched, wanting so badly to be chosen. Can you see them not as weak, but as brave for having survived this long? They don't need to be told to toughen up. They need to be told you were never too much. You were never wrong for feeling deeply. You were never meant to earn love by erasing yourself. They need to hear that the gaslighting wasn't their fault. That manipulation doesn't mean they were broken, only that someone else was terrified of their light. And so the work of healing begins not in analysis, but in re-parenting, in gently replacing the gaslighter's voice with your own, a voice that doesn't rush, doesn't punish, doesn't distort, but simply says, I see you and I believe you. That might be the most radical act you ever take to believe yourself again, and even when no one else does. Even when your memory feels shaky, even when doubt creeps in. Because the truth is, gaslighting can only survive where the inner child has been abandoned. But the moment you return, truly return to that part of you, the manipulation begins to lose its grip. It can't control someone who is no longer seeking permission to exist. So here's a soft question to carry into the night. What would it look like to be loyal to yourself first? Not out of defiance, but out of remembrance? The kind of remembrance that feels like coming home, not to who you were told to be, but to who you've always been. You're too sensitive. You always overreact. You're just being dramatic. These aren't just comments. They're calibrations. Over time, they become scaffolding, invisible structures that quietly shape how you see yourself. You don't just hear them. You start to believe them. Slowly, quietly, you absorb them like truth. And once internalized, they become a lens through which you interpret every emotion, every memory, every reaction. This is the identity trap. Not the obvious kind where someone openly attacks your character, but the soft, everyday kind where your self-image is gradually rewritten in someone else's handwriting, not through screaming, but through suggestion, through repetition, through tone. It's not what they say once. It's what they say again and again until it no longer feels foreign. It feels like your own voice. The most painful part of this trap is that it doesn't feel like you're being controlled. It feels like you're finally seeing yourself clearly as flawed, unstable, difficult. It feels like self-awareness, but it's really self-distortion because you're not discovering your identity. You're inheriting it from someone who benefits when you feel small, someone who subtly rewards you for shrinking, for apologizing first, for taking the blame even when you're confused. And slowly you begin to confuse humility with self-erasure. Alfred Adler once said that people are not driven by past causes, but by future goals, often unconscious ones. And for many of us caught in manipulation, the unconscious goal becomes safety through acceptance. So we contort. We become who they say we are because being that person seems safer than constant resistance. We trade truth for peace, and peace for proximity. But proximity without authenticity is not safety. It's self-abandonment dressed up as loyalty. There's a moment, sometimes quiet, sometimes devastating, when you realize I don't know who I am when I'm not being corrected. That's the heart of the identity trap. You've spent so long adjusting yourself around someone else's comfort that your own contours feel unfamiliar. You've dimmed the parts of you that sparked conflict. You've muted the edges that made you difficult. And in doing so, you've mistaken survival for personality. But the truth is, who you became to be loved is not the same as who you are. The paradox here is cruel. The more you accept their version of you, the more unstable you feel. Because deep down, your soul remembers who you were before distortion. It remembers the joy that didn't need permission, the anger that wasn't shameful, the needs that weren't labeled as burdens. That memory may be faint, but it's persistent. It shows up in the discomfort you feel when someone praises your calmness, even though it was born from silencing your truth. It surfaces when you cry and then immediately apologize as if your emotions have to be justified. That tension is your identity trying to surface like roots pushing through concrete. Symbolically, it's like wearing a mask that starts to melt in the sun. At first, it gave you protection. It made you palatable, but now it's dissolving not because you failed, but because the truth can't be contained forever. The sun in this image is your awareness, your healing. And as it rises, the mask, the identity given to you by gaslighting begins to fall away. It's messy, disorienting, but sometimes painful. Because once the mask is gone, you're left with a raw face, unsure, unpracticed, honest, but also real. And that realness, even if unfamiliar, is where you begin to rebuild, not from the feedback of others, but from quiet observation, from listening to yourself before asking for validation, from letting an emotion exist without explaining it away, from realizing that too sensitive is not a flaw, it's a warning bell that someone tried to numb your boundaries. That too much was code for too aware. That dramatic was a tactic to shame your truth into silence. Gaslighting manipulates language to trap identity. It teaches you to doubt adjectives, to disown verbs, to apologize for your very being. But identity is not fixed. It is not a verdict handed down by others. It is not the echo of someone else's fear. Identity is fluid, but it should always flow from the inside out, not the outside in. You don't have to stay what they said you were. You don't have to keep being the version that got you through. You are allowed to evolve into someone who no longer fits the story they wrote about you. Here's a soft question to carry with you. If you had never been told who you are, who would you be? Sit with that. Not to answer it quickly, but to feel what rises in its presence. Sometimes it's grief. Sometimes it's relief. Often it's both. Because letting go of the false self means mourning it even if it was never truly you. It meant something. It protected you. It got you here. But now you're allowed to outgrow it. So you begin again, gently. You write your own adjectives. You trust your own nouns. You move without asking, does this make me too much? And in doing so, you start to reclaim something deeper than confidence. You reclaim authorship. You become the narrator of your own becoming. And maybe you begin to feel at home inside your own name again. There is a particular kind of disorientation that settles in when your truth collides with someone else's, not in disagreement, but in denial. You find yourself caught between what you felt and what you're being told. A look you know was cruel is called a joke. A silence you remember as cold is reframed as forgetfulness. A moment that rattled you is dismissed as your imagination. And so you hesitate. You revisit the moment again and again, like walking in circles through a familiar room that no longer has any doors. You know what you experienced, but you can't explain it in a way they'll accept. And eventually that gap between your truth and their version becomes unbearable. That's when the maze begins. You try to reconcile the contradiction. You bend, twist, rationalize. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe your past is making you too reactive. And each maybe leads to another corridor, another dead end. This is the psychological tension known as cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we feel when we try to hold two opposing beliefs at the same time. On one hand, you believe you're a perceptive person. On the other, you're being told your perception is always off. On one hand, you trust your emotions. On the other, you're told your emotions are flawed. That dissonance doesn't just create confusion, it creates exhaustion because the mind isn't designed to hold contradictions forever. It will eventually choose the path of least resistance, often at the cost of your own truth. It's in these moments that gaslighting becomes more than manipulation. It becomes self-erasure, not because someone forced you to forget, but because your survival instincts led you there. You wanted peace. You wanted connection. You wanted to stop feeling like the antagonist in your own life. And so you let go of what you knew just a little. You folded a corner of the memory. You softened the edge of your conviction. You stayed quiet, not because you were wrong, but because you were tired of explaining yourself to someone who never listened. Philip Zimbardo's infamous Stanford prison experiment revealed something deeply uncomfortable about human nature when people are placed in systems that reward domination, and submission, they adapt quickly, even when they know better, even when it goes against their values. It's not that they become bad people, it's that they become products of the environment. In a gaslighting dynamic, the environment is a maze of emotional contradictions. And the more you try to behave correctly within it, the more lost you become, because the rules keep changing. What was acceptable yesterday is offensive today. What earned praise before now invites ridicule, and no matter how well you navigate it, the finish line keeps moving. Symbolically, it's like being inside a hallway where every door leads back to the same room. You try to find the truth, but every attempt is met with another twist, another denial, another version, and you begin to feel like the confusion itself is your fault, as if your inability to find clarity is a reflection of your own inadequacy, not the intentional misdirection of another. That's the genius of the maze. It makes you believe you built it, and so you turn inward. You become hypervigilant. Every word you say is measured. Every emotion is analyzed before it's expressed. You walk on eggshells, not because someone threatened you, but because you've learned that clarity comes at a cost. And over time, you forget what it felt like to speak without hesitation, to feel without defending, to remember without being corrected. But here's a gentle truth. Mazes are not infinite. They just feel that way when you stop trusting your steps. The first way out is not through confrontation. It's through anchoring. Remembering one true thing, one moment you're sure of, one feeling that still feels real. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be as simple as I felt hurt when they laughed at me. That's not an accusation, it's a truth. And when you speak it, even just to yourself, the walls begin to shift. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough for light to seep in. The paradox is this: the more you seek external validation of your truth, the more you stay in the maze. Because in gaslighting, the other person is not a guide. They are the architect. Your clarity cannot come from them. It must be rebuilt from within, gently, patiently, with compassion for all the ways you tried to stay safe. So ask yourself, what moment do I still believe even if no one else does? Let it anchor you. Not to fuel resentment, but to remind you that the maze wasn't yours to begin with. You were just trying to find the exit. And in trying so hard to make it make sense, you forgot you were allowed to leave. And maybe now you're ready to find the door. Not all control comes wrapped in cruelty. Not all manipulation is loud. Sometimes it's quiet, tender even. It shows up with a soft tone and concerned eyes. It offers you advice you didn't ask for. It tells you it's only doing this because it cares, that it knows you better than you know yourself, and because it never shouts, because it doesn't threaten, because it wraps itself in warmth. You hesitate to call it what it is. But control doesn't need to be violent to be real. It doesn't need to leave bruises to leave marks. The most effective manipulation often happens in a whisper. It's the velvet glove you thank while it tightens around you. This is the kind of gaslighting that's hardest to name because it looks like love. It sounds like concern. I'm just worried about you. You know I only want what's best. These phrases disarm you, lower your guard, make you question whether you're just being defensive. You find yourself smiling through discomfort, laughing at jokes that sting, agreeing to things you don't fully understand because resistance feels ungrateful. You convince yourself that being loved means being guided, even when that guidance leads you away from yourself. In this dynamic, the manipulator isn't cruel, they're charming, attentive, generous even. They know how to mirror your insecurities and reflect back exactly what you want to hear until you begin to rely on them for clarity. They'll praise you for your openness, then gently suggest how you should think. They'll tell you You're so wise, and then slowly make you doubt every instinct you have. And because it doesn't feel like domination, because it feels like intimacy, you let them in. You offer them access to your mind, your choices, your story, and in return they offer certainty. But certainty is not the same as truth. Certainty is what we crave when we're tired, when the world feels too complex. And manipulators, especially the soft-spoken ones, offer certainty like medicine. They tell you who you are, what you need, who you should avoid. They frame your reactions as predictable your pain, as instructive your doubts, as flaws, and all of it sounds so reasonable, so mature, so loving, until you realize that your voice has gone silent in the conversation, that you're nodding at things that don't sit right, that you're living a life where your choices are pre-approved by someone else. Jung wrote that we often mistake the voice of the superego, the internalized authority figure, for our own conscience. In gaslighting, that voice is planted by another. And once internalized, it sounds just like you. It becomes the inner critic that stops you from trusting your gut. It mimics your compassion, it wears your vocabulary. And because it no longer comes from outside, because it now lives in your own mind, it's almost impossible to dislodge without help. Symbolically, it's like a room draped in velvet. Everything is soft, everything is curated, but you're not allowed to open the windows. The air never changes, the comfort becomes a cage. And because you've been trained to associate softness with safety, you stay. You decorate the room, you adjust to the stillness, you forget what fresh air feels like. That's the brilliance of silent control. It doesn't make you flee, it makes you settle. This dynamic is particularly powerful in romantic relationships, spiritual communities, mentorship roles, anywhere where trust is high and expectations are unspoken. And often the manipulator believes their own narrative. They may not see themselves as controlling. They may believe they're helping you, protecting you, loving you. That's what makes it so difficult to unravel when both people are convinced they're participating in care. But real care doesn't require agreement. Real love doesn't ask you to shrink. It doesn't offer guidance at the expense of autonomy. It doesn't create dependency. If someone's presence in your life makes your own voice quieter, your choices blurrier, your instincts harder to hear, then that presence is not supportive, it's consuming. There's a paradox here that's easy to miss. The softer the control, the harder it is to escape, because you can't fight what you can't name. You can't resist what feels like kindness. And when your nervous system has been conditioned to see gentleness as love, even when it costs you your truth, you will stay far longer than you realize, not out of weakness, but out of confusion. So here's the soft question to hold in your chest. What's the difference between being loved and being managed? Sit with it, let it echo. Not to accuse, but to awaken. Because power that whispers is still power. And you deserve to know when it's being used to rewrite you. There's no shame in falling for soft control. It speaks to your tenderness, not your ignorance. It means you're wired for connection, for hope, for believing the best in people. But tenderness doesn't have to cost you clarity, and love should never require silence. If you find yourself in a room that feels safe but stifling, you're allowed to crack a window. You're allowed to ask, what do I want separate from their voice? You're allowed to step into the noise of your own intuition, even if it trembles at first. Because your voice doesn't need to be loud to be true, it just needs space to return. There's a moment quiet, private, and haunting when you find yourself apologizing, but you're not quite sure what for. Maybe you said too much, or maybe you didn't say it the right way. Maybe your face gave something away, or your silence felt like an accusation. So you say, I'm sorry, reflexively, as if those words can restore balance, as if they can buy you peace. But it's not peace you're buying, it's permission. Permission to feel, permission to exist without conflict. And the more you say it, the more it becomes a loop, a shame loop, where guilt is no longer tied to your actions, but to your very presence. Gaslighting doesn't just distort memory, it weaponizes shame. It convinces you that discomfort in the relationship is your fault. That tension means you did something wrong. And because you're kind, because you care, you don't want to be the source of harm. So you preemptively blame yourself. You become the fixer, the emotional janitor, the one who sweeps up the mess even when it's not yours, not because you're weak, but because you've been trained to feel responsible for everyone else's comfort. Gabor Maté writes that children will always choose attachment over authenticity, that it's safer evolutionarily to believe I am bad than to believe my caregiver is unsafe. That belief doesn't go away in adulthood. It just becomes more sophisticated. You start to think you're flawed, too sensitive too much, not because you are, but because that belief allows you to stay close to the person causing harm. If it's your fault, then you can fix it. If it's about you, then maybe changing yourself will change the outcome. And so shame becomes the leash, a quiet tether that keeps you in the same pattern, apologizing for needs that were never wrong to begin with. It's a cruel paradox. The more you internalize the shame, the less likely you are to leave. Because by then, the relationship has become a referendum on your worth. Staying becomes a kind of proof that you're strong enough, loyal enough, loving enough to endure it. And leaving feels like failure, like giving up, like confirming you are the problem. That's the trap. You're stuck trying to prove that you're good inside a system designed to make you feel otherwise. Symbolically, it's like living in a cage with the door wide open. You could leave, no one's holding you back, but you've been told that freedom makes you selfish, that leaving means abandoning someone who needs you, that choosing yourself is unkind. And so you stay, you pace the cage, you decorate it, you call it home, and all the while you wonder why you feel so small. The shame loop also feeds on silence. When you try to explain what you're feeling, you're met with disbelief or dismissal. So eventually, you stop trying. You withhold, you hide your confusion behind smiles, you turn the pain inward, and the silence becomes evidence. See, you tell yourself, no one else sees it, so maybe it's me. But silence isn't proof of guilt. It's often the residue of survival. You go quiet, not because you're wrong, but because you've been punished for speaking. The most painful part, you begin to police yourself. Long before the gaslighter responds, you've already anticipated their reaction. You edit your words in advance. You hesitate to feel anger because you know it'll be used against you. You rehearse how to explain your pain in a way that won't trigger deflection. And when it still does, you blame yourself for not being clearer, not being calm enough, not being perfect. It's like arguing with a funhouse mirror and then blaming yourself for being distorted. But here's something you might have forgotten. Your feelings are not crimes. Your needs are not threats. Your memories are not weapons. And your existence is not an inconvenience. Shame taught you to shrink, but healing invites you to re-expand gently without apology, to return to the parts of yourself you exiled in the name of keeping peace, the fire, the voice, the instincts, the soft refusal to be defined by someone else's fear. Here's a soft question to ask in the middle of the loop. What am I apologizing for? And who taught me it was wrong? Sit with it, trace it. Sometimes the shame isn't even yours. Sometimes it was inherited, passed down, like a superstition. And when you finally see that you're allowed to put it down, not out of spite, but out of mercy. Because shame is not your foundation. It's the dust that settled on you while you tried to belong. and you don't have to carry it forever. There's a moment subtle, almost imperceptible, when you test the edges of your experience by sharing it with someone else. A friend, a sibling, a coworker. You mention the strange way a conversation made you feel. You offer up your confusion like a question. Does that sound off to you? And you wait, hoping for a mirror, hoping for resonance, but instead, you get a shrug, or worse, agreement with a gaslighter's version. They probably didn't mean it like that. You're always reading too much into things, and just like that, your doubt multiplies, because now it's not just one voice rewriting your truth, it's a chorus, and the gaslight becomes an echo chamber. In these moments, reality starts to fracture. You know something's wrong, your body tells you, your emotions tell you, but the social world doesn't reflect it back. And humans are relational creatures. We calibrate our sense of reality not in isolation, but in connection. If enough people tell you that you're misreading, misremembering, misbehaving, you start to believe them, even when your nervous system is screaming, even when your intuition whispers something's off. That silence, that lack of reflection is what makes collective gaslighting so devastating. It turns your pain into a private burden and your story into a secret. This is especially common in families, workplaces, spiritual groups, any environment with an unspoken hierarchy or golden child dynamic. The gaslighter isn't always the only one manipulating. Sometimes they're protected by a network of enablers, people who need the narrative to stay intact, who can't afford to believe your version because it would shatter their comfort, their loyalty, their illusion of safety. And so they mirror the gaslighter's language. Not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. They choose coherence over truth. But coherence is not clarity. It's conformity. And when everyone agrees on a version of reality that contradicts your own, you start to wonder, am I the problem? That question doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sits in the back of your throat for years. It shapes how you speak, how you trust, how you interpret feedback. You become cautious, over-explaining, seeking permission to feel what you feel. And when someone finally does believe you, even just a little, you weep. Not because of what was done to you, but because of how long you carried it alone. Symbolically, it's like shouting into a canyon that gives no echo. You send your truth out into the world, and it disappears. No bounce, no reflection, just silence. And after a while, you stop shouting, you whisper. Then you stop speaking altogether. Not because your story isn't real, but because no one seems willing to hold it. This kind of erasure doesn't just come from gaslighters, it comes from systems, from cultures that prioritize harmony over honesty, from families that mistake silence for peace, from communities that call dissent disrespect. And so the gaslighting expands beyond the personal. It becomes institutional. And healing from it requires more than confronting one person. It requires reclaiming your reflection, even if you have to build the mirror yourself. But here's the thing, the echo isn't gone. It was just suppressed. Your truth still lives in your body. It still pulses beneath your ribs. It shows up in the way your voice shakes when you try to name what happened, in the tears that surprise you when someone finally says, that wasn't okay, in the way your breath changes when you speak your story aloud and someone doesn't flinch. That's not validation, that's rehumanization. There's a paradox here. As always, the more people deny your truth, the more vital it becomes to speak it. Not louder, but truer. Not for agreement, but for integration. Because the goal isn't to convince them, it's to reconnect with yourself. To rebuild the inner echo chamber where your emotions bounce back as information, not accusation. where your story reverberates without being silenced. So here's a soft question. If no one believed you, would your truth still matter? Let that settle. Let it hurt. Let it heal. Because your worth is not measured by consensus. Your pain is not a debate. Your clarity doesn't require a cosign. It's enough that you know. It's enough that your body remembered when your mind was taught to forget. You don't need an audience to be real. You need a witness, even if that witness is you. Not all manipulation is found in what is said. Some of the deepest wounds come from what is not. A glance that lingers too long, a pause before answering, the withheld apology, the conversation that veers just slightly off course enough to leave you confused but unable to explain why. These are the silences between words, the spaces where meaning hangs suspended, where language becomes a tool, not of connection, but of control. In the world of gaslighting, silence is not absence, it's design, a careful withholding, a calculated vacancy that draws you in, unsettles you, makes you try harder. And that's the point, not to destroy you, but to make you doubt yourself enough to stay. You learn to read tone like a second language. You hear, "I'm fine," and spend hours analyzing the pitch, the pacing, the look in their eyes. You become fluent in emotional subtext because the actual text always shifts. And over time, you start to doubt the value of words altogether. You find yourself reading vibe instead of content. You speak cautiously, monitoring not just what you say, but how it lands. And when something goes wrong, when a reaction feels too sharp or too cold, you blame your delivery. You wonder if you should have used different phrasing, if you should have timed it better. As if love were a code you keep failing to crack. Gaslighting thrives in this kind of ambiguity. Because when there's no clear accusation, there's nothing to push against. When someone withholds affection without explanation or subtly shifts the emotional climate of the room, you can't point to anything concrete. And so you internalize the shift as your fault. You become the adjuster, the empath, the emotional detective, trying to piece together a story from crumbs and echoes, not because you're obsessed, but because you're trying to stay safe in a conversation where the rules are never spoken aloud. This kind of manipulation is harder to name than overt lies. It's not "you're wrong." It's "I don't remember that." It's not "you're crazy." That's not how I saw it. It's the eyebrow raised mid-sentence, the sigh just before you finish speaking. It's passive, but deeply persuasive, because it relies on your capacity for empathy, on your need to make sense of the dissonance. And so you begin to explain their behavior even as it chips away at you. Symbolically, it's like reading a book where every other sentence has been redacted. You're trying to follow the plot, but entire pages are missing. You don't know who the characters are anymore. You don't know what's true. And yet, you keep reading, hoping the next chapter will make it all make sense. But it never does. Because the silence isn't accidental. It's authored. And you're not the reader. You're the one being rewritten. In some ways, this is the most insidious form of control because it never names itself. It hides behind politeness, behind mature conversations, behind vague statements that leave you more confused than before. And when you bring up your confusion, you're met with calm denial. "That's not what I meant. You're reading too much into it." And again, the silence wins. Jung wrote about the complex, unconscious, emotional patterns that distort our perception. In the context of gaslighting, the silence itself becomes a complex. You begin to associate silence with tension, with guilt, with rejection. A lack of response starts to feel like a verdict. And because you've been trained to fill in the blanks, to assume responsibility, you rarely consider that the silence might be strategic. That someone else is creating space not to reflect, but to control. So you apologize first. You over-explain. You anticipate needs that haven't been voiced. You write paragraphs to clarify a message that was never misunderstood in the first place, because what you're really trying to do is reestablish connection. You're trying to pull language back into the room, to close the gap, to find something solid in the fog. But language is not shared here. It's rationed, and the silence is not an empty space. It's a cage you've been taught to decorate. But here's the paradox. The silence that destabilizes you can also be reclaimed. You don't have to fill every pause. You don't have to decode every glance. You're allowed to let ambiguity be ambiguous. Not everything has to be made safe through understanding. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stop explaining, to let their silence stay theirs, and to return to your own clarity, not as a defense, but as a ground. Here's the soft question to ask. What have I been trying to say that no one is hearing, not to make them hear it, but to hear it yourself, to speak it aloud in a room where only you are listening, to remember that your voice doesn't exist to fix misunderstandings. It exists to express truth. And sometimes truth lives in your full sentences, not in their edited replies. You don't need to be fluent in someone else's silence. You only need to trust your own sound. There's something sacred about memory. It holds our sense of self, our history, our choices, our growth. It gives shape to who we are. But gaslighting doesn't just target emotion or identity. It wages quiet war on memory. Not all at once, not with force, but with subtle, persistent edits. A question here, a correction there, and slowly the architecture of your past starts to shift. What once felt vivid becomes uncertain. What once felt clear becomes questionable. And in time, you begin to wonder if the story you've been living is even yours anymore. It starts small, a date, a phrase, a moment you both remember differently, but the other person is so confident, so calm, so certain. That's not how it happened. You always get these things confused. You hesitate. You replay the scene in your mind. You can see it, the room, the tone, the look in their eyes, and yet they insist. And so you falter. You want to be fair. You want to be reasonable. And in that openness, your memory bends. Not because it's false, but because it's being weighed against someone else's certainty. And over time, that weight starts to erode the edges of your recall. Psychologists call this confabulation, when the brain under pressure fills in gaps in memory with plausible but inaccurate details. It's not deception, it's survival. In environments where your version of events is constantly challenged, your brain adapts. It starts to edit your past in ways that minimize conflict, that reduce friction, that help you function. But the cost is high, because when your memory becomes a negotiation, your identity begins to dissolve. Symbolically, it's like flipping through a photo album and finding faces blurred, places missing, dates altered. You recognize the frame, but not the content. You know something happened. You can feel the emotional residue, but the details won't settle. And when you try to explain that feeling, you're told it's in your head, that you're too sensitive, that you're imagining things. And the more this happens, the more your internal compass begins to spin. Not wildly, just subtly, quietly, persistently. There's something terrifying about not trusting your own recollection. It makes you dependent, vulnerable. You begin to check your memories against the gaslighter's version. You ask questions not to seek truth, but to confirm alignment. And if your version doesn't match theirs, you assume yours must be flawed because they seem so sure, so emotionally regulated, and you're anxious, you're emotional, you're grasping. But here's the trap that very dynamic is part of the manipulation. Their calmness doesn't mean accuracy, it means control. Carl Jung wrote about the unconscious as a storehouse of forgotten truths, not erased, but buried. And in gaslighting, the unconscious becomes cluttered with suppressed memory, moments you stopped trusting, emotions you invalidated, truths you swallowed. And those fragments don't vanish. They live in dreams, in body aches, in sudden tears. They whisper through the cracks, trying to remind you of what was real, but you've been trained to mistrust those whispers, to doubt the voice inside that says, I remember. And yet, that voice persists, even in the fog, even after years of self-erasure. It shows up in the way your body reacts when someone denies something you're sure of. It lives in the chill that runs through you when the story being told doesn't match what you know. That's not dysfunction. That's your nervous system trying to preserve you, trying to say something is off here. Stay close to yourself. The paradox of gaslighting is that it doesn't just steal memories, it makes you complicit in forgetting. Because to survive the dissonance you agree to let go, you choose peace over clarity. And eventually, you forget what you've forgotten. That's the real loss. Not just of memory, but of trust. Trust in your own mind, your own perception, your own truth. But here's a softer truth: memory is resilient. It doesn't need to be perfect to be valid. Your emotions are part of your memory. Your body is part of your memory. And even if the details are fuzzy, the feeling is real. The ache is real. The discomfort is real, and that's enough. You don't need photographic recall to claim your story. You just need to stop giving others the power to narrate it for you. So ask this question gently: what do I still remember even if no one believes me? Not to win an argument, but to reclaim your reflection, to honor the version of you that was there, that felt it, that held it, that deserves to be heard. You don't need their agreement to know what happened. You just need your own quiet, unwavering voice, the one that still remembers, not because it's flawless, but because it's yours. It always starts the same way. A moment of tension, a disagreement, a look that lingers just a second too long. Your body tightens, your throat dries, you feel the old instinct rise, and without thinking you say it, I'm sorry. Not because you've done something wrong, not because you believe you were out of line, but because you've been here before, because you've learned that apologizing is the fastest way to make it stop, to soothe the unease, to avoid the spiral. And so again, you offer up those two small words like a sacrifice, a peace offering, a temporary truce. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. This is the apology loop, the emotional cycle where you take responsibility, not just for your actions, but for the feelings, reactions, and discomforts of others, where I'm sorry becomes not a reflection of remorse, but a strategy for emotional survival. Over time, it becomes automatic, a reflex. You apologize for asking questions, for expressing hurt, for setting boundaries, for remembering differently, for needing more. And eventually you apologize for simply being too much, too intense, too emotional, too inconvenient. But that's not humility, that's programming. Gaslighting plants the seeds of this loop early. It doesn't always demand an apology directly. Sometimes it just withholds warmth, shifts tone, goes quiet until you rush to fill the silence with contrition. And when you do, the warmth returns. You're rewarded. The storm passes and the lesson is clear. If you want love, be small, be agreeable, be sorry. What makes this cycle so difficult to break is that it often masquerades as emotional maturity. You tell yourself you're being accountable, that you're self-aware, that you're preventing escalation, but real accountability involves mutual recognition. Real maturity doesn't require you to carry the emotional weight for two. And when apologies become currency when they're the only way to restore peace, you're no longer in relationship, you're in submission. Symbolically, it's like writing apology letters and leaving them unsigned, not because the recipient is unknown, but because over time, you become the only one doing the writing. You're apologizing into a void, hoping the echo will soften something, but it never does. Because the more you apologize, the more is expected. The more your silence is interpreted as guilt. The more your pain becomes a burden you're meant to hide. Not because you're wrong, but because your truth makes others uncomfortable. Here's the paradox: the more you apologize to maintain the connection, the more disconnected you become from yourself. Your boundaries blur, your instincts fade, you start to lose track of when the rupture even began or if it was ever yours to repair in the first place. And in the absence of clarity, you default to guilt. Because guilt at least offers a script. I'm sorry. I'll try harder. I'll be better. But better according to whose standards, who decided your needs were excessive, who taught you that honesty was aggression, that sensitivity was instability, that self-expression was something to be managed. This loop isn't just personal, it's cultural, especially for those raised in environments where obedience was prized over authenticity, where harmony was a higher value than truth, where survival meant anticipating the emotions of others and preemptively absorbing their discomfort. And so you learn to apologize for having boundaries, for changing, for growing, for leaving, for becoming someone who no longer fits the mold they built around you. But here's something quiet and radical. You don't need to apologize for your evolution, for your voice, for the truth that rose up in your chest when someone tried to edit your memory. That truth doesn't need to be defended. It needs to be trusted. Carl Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming whole, involves reclaiming the parts of ourselves we disowned to survive. And often those parts are the ones that stopped apologizing, the ones that spoke up, the ones that said no and meant it. The parts we were told were rude, rebellious, defiant. But those parts aren't dangerous. They're boundary lines. They are the architecture of self-respect. So here's the soft question. What have you been apologizing for that you no longer believe is wrong? Sit with it. Not to confront, but to reclaim. Maybe it was your intensity, your silence, your passion, your grief, your truth. Maybe it was your need for space, or your refusal to be rewritten. Whatever it is, you don't have to keep handing out apologies like bandages for wounds you didn't cause. You are allowed to exist without justification, to feel without defense, to remember without permission. And maybe you can start saying, I'm sorry only when you mean it, not when you're trying to be allowed. There comes a moment, often after the noise, after the conflict, after the endless justifications, when you grow quiet. Not out of fear, not out of resignation, but because something inside you begins to shift. A faint recognition, a memory of who you were before you became someone else's version of you. And in that stillness, you begin to reclaim something that was never truly lost, only buried beneath the need to be believed, understood, accepted. This is where identity begins to return, not with grand declarations, but with silence. A sacred listening kind of silence. The kind that lets the dust settle so you can see the outline of yourself again. You don't need to explain yourself here. You don't need to correct their version of events. You don't need to be louder. Because healing isn't always about proving anything. Sometimes it's about sitting with your truth in a room where no one can take it from you. That's the paradox of reclamation. It doesn't begin with action. It begins with presence, with stillness, with the gentle turning inward that says, I am still here. At first, it feels unfamiliar, like trying on clothes you forgot you owned, like hearing your own voice after years of speaking in someone else's dialect. But with each breath, each word written in a journal no one else will read, you start to remember. The phrases that were once automatic, maybe I'm overreacting, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, begin to fade. Not with force, but with disuse. They no longer fit. They no longer serve, because you're no longer in a relationship with someone else's version of your mind. You begin to make small decisions without checking for approval. You feel the impulse to justify and let it pass. You feel the familiar tightness in your chest when setting a boundary, and you breathe through it instead of apologizing. These are not acts of defiance. They're acts of return. Return to the core of you, the part that once believed in your own perception without needing external confirmation. That part isn't gone. It's waiting, like a locked diary, slowly opening. And inside that diary are fragments. Half-written thoughts, pieces of memory, flashes of feelings that were once dismissed. You begin to read them without judgment, without needing to organize them into a perfect narrative. This is where integration begins, where you start to realize that wholeness isn't about being right, it's about being real. Adler would say that human beings are goal-oriented, that even our pain has a purpose. And maybe the purpose of this pain was to bring you back to yourself, to force a reckoning with the parts of you that were too long neglected in the pursuit of being good, agreeable, easy to love. Maybe the silence you feared all this time wasn't abandonment, but invitation, an invitation to listen deeper. To listen past the noise of their denial, past the scripts you inherited, past the shame that wrapped itself around your voice. And when you sit in that silence long enough, something emerges. Not confidence exactly, not yet, but steadiness. A sense that you don't need to chase validation because you've already found something truer, your own knowing. You remember that gaslighting didn't break you, it bent you. And you're not here to stay bent. You're here to unfold slowly, tenderly, on your terms. Symbolically, this process is like standing in a room after a storm. The windows are fogged, the furniture is disheveled, but the foundation is intact. And as you begin to clean, to reorder, to reclaim, you realize that you're not rebuilding someone else's house. You're rebuilding your own, and this time, every item in it will belong to you. Every thought, every feeling, every memory that refused to be erased. Here's a soft question to carry with you now. What does your truth sound like when no one else is in the room? Not the defensive version, not the polite edit, but the raw, unfiltered essence of what you know, of what your body remembers, of what your heart still holds. You don't need to speak it aloud yet. You don't need to post it or prove it or package it. You only need to recognize it, because recognition is the first act of return. And return is the beginning of becoming. It's easy and understandable to cast the gaslighter as the villain, to hold their words, their denials, their manipulations under the microscope and say, that's the problem. And in many ways it is. Naming the wound matters. Naming who caused it matters. But there's another truth that's harder to hold, softer, more uncomfortable, yet deeply liberating. It's the recognition that the gaslighter lives not only outside us, but sometimes within. That somewhere quietly hidden in the corners of our psyche, we have learned to do to ourselves what others once did to us. To doubt, to rewrite, to suppress. Not because we are cruel, but because we were taught that distortion was safer than honesty. This is what Carl Jung called the shadow, the unconscious part of us that contains what we disown, deny, repress. Not just our rage or fear, but our subtle manipulations. Our desires to control, our capacity to distort truth, not always in others, but in ourselves. And the paradox is painful. Many of us who have been manipulated have also learned to manipulate, to curate our truth, to manage perception, to twist our feelings, just enough to stay acceptable. We learn the dance so well that we now lead it without even noticing. Perhaps it began when you swallowed your sadness because someone said it was too much, or when you smiled through pain to avoid being called dramatic, or when you told a half-truth to maintain connection, even though the full truth was waiting behind your eyes. These aren't sins, these are adaptations, learned behaviors from years of being told that who you are is negotiable. But the danger of the shadow is that it operates in silence. We gaslight ourselves in the same rhythm we once resisted. We hear our intuition and dismiss it. We feel a need and label it irrational. We remember something painful and tell ourselves, it wasn't that bad, that voice. It's not always the gaslighter. Sometimes it's our internalized version of them, a ghost we keep feeding. And if we're not careful, we can turn that shadow outward, projecting it onto others, questioning their feelings, dismissing their perceptions, not because we want to harm, but because their truth triggers something unresolved in us. It reminds us of the parts we're still afraid to look at. And so we manage, we advise, we reframe, we do what was once done to us, believing we're helping, believing we're guiding. But control, even dressed as concern, is still control. Jung warned that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. And so the work becomes not just healing from the gaslighter, but becoming aware of the gaslighter within. The part of us that edits ourselves, that corrects our memories, that whispers, "You're being too much," even when no one else is in the room. This isn't a call for shame. It's an invitation to tenderness, to self-honesty, because shadow work isn't about blame. It's about balance. It's about realizing that the more we suppress our own truth, the more likely we are to need control over ourselves, over others, over perception itself. But when we allow our truth to breathe, to stumble, to be imperfect, the need for manipulation softens. Symbolically, it's like holding a flashlight and finally turning it toward yourself, not to accuse, but to illuminate, to see where the echo of past pain still shapes your present choices, to notice when you silence yourself before anyone else does, to notice when you bend your voice to match someone else's comfort, and to ask gently, why? Because maybe you learned that survival required performance, that honesty risked rejection, that showing your full self meant being alone, and those lessons became scripts that still whisper when you try to speak freely. But here's the shift: you don't have to keep playing that role. You can retire the inner manipulator, not by punishing it, but by understanding it. By holding it in your hands and saying, I know why you exist, and I no longer need you to keep me safe. So here's the soft question for this night. Where am I still gaslighting myself? And what am I afraid will happen if I stop? You don't have to answer out loud. Just notice. Just let the question sit in the silence. Let it point you toward the parts of you that are still waiting to be heard. Because healing from manipulation isn't just about escape. It's about integration. It's about becoming the person who no longer needs distortion to feel worthy, who no longer trades authenticity for safety, who no longer hides from their own light. And maybe that starts with forgiving the version of you who once thought control was the only way to survive. It's tempting to see the gaslighter as a villain, cold, calculated, inherently cruel. And sometimes that's true, but more often the story is more complex and more tragic, because gaslighting isn't always born from malice. It's born from fear, from fragility, from a deep gnawing insecurity that says, if I don't control the story, I might disappear inside it. The gaslighter, in many cases, is not a person who feels powerful. They are a person terrified of powerlessness. And in that fear, they rewrite the narrative, not just for you, but for themselves. This doesn't excuse the harm. It doesn't erase the confusion, the emotional corrosion, the damage done. But understanding the origin of their behavior gives you back something important: clarity. And with clarity comes separation. You begin to realize their actions were about their survival, not your worth. Imagine a cracked teacup glued over and over again, barely holding its shape. That's the inner world of many gaslighters. They fear being seen not because they're hiding something sinister, but because they were never taught how to hold the messiness of being human. Vulnerability terrifies them. Accountability feels like annihilation. And so they control, they distort, they defend against the unbearable truth that they too are flawed, scared, and deeply afraid of being abandoned. In childhood, some learned that love was conditional, that mistakes were punished, that emotions were dangerous. They were raised in households where truth was unstable, where feelings weren't validated but redirected. And in that environment, gaslighting became a shield, a way to rewrite stories that felt too painful to face, to twist perception just enough to make themselves feel safe, even if it meant someone else had to feel confused. Others learned it through modeling. They watched their parents rewrite the past, say one thing and later deny it. Mask conflict with smiles, shift blame with grace. And so gaslighting wasn't seen as cruelty, it was seen as normalcy, a family tradition of narrative control, of emotional sleight of hand. Then there are those who gaslight because they can't tolerate being the bad guy. The idea that they hurt someone, even unintentionally, shatters their self-image. So they deny. Not because they don't believe you, but because believing you would require them to confront a shame too heavy to hold. They rewrite your story to protect their own. And in doing so, they sacrifice connection for control. Jung might say they are possessed by a complex, a bundle of unresolved wounds that take over when threatened. In these moments, the gaslighter isn't a puppet master. They're a puppet themselves, dancing to the fears they've never confronted. And the more you try to hold them accountable, the more they flail. Not because you're wrong, but because they don't have the tools to sit in discomfort, to admit fault, to stay. The paradox is painful. The gaslighter often needs intimacy as much as anyone, but destroys it trying to protect themselves from its demands. They crave love, but can't hold its mirror. They want to be understood, but can't tolerate your truth if it contradicts their narrative. So they choose manipulation over mutuality, not because it works, but because it's what they know. Symbolically, their world is built on a foundation of cracked mirrors. Every time they see their reflection in your pain, they turn away. They polish the glass, reframe, the angle, shift, the lighting, anything to avoid the rawness of reality. And in that avoidance, they convince themselves that they're the ones being wronged, that you're the aggressor, that your memory, your emotions, your perception is the threat. This is why confronting a gaslighter often doesn't work, because the confrontation isn't happening between equals. It's happening between someone grounded in their truth and someone drowning in their defense mechanisms. They aren't in the present moment with you. They're stuck in the past, in a loop of survival strategies forged long before you entered the picture. So where does that leave you? Angry, maybe? Exhausted, confused, wanting to fix it and explain it reached them? And that's the heartbreak you can't. Because gaslighting is not a dialogue problem, it's a self-awareness problem. It can't be solved through better arguments or more compassion. It can only be solved through the gaslighter's willingness to meet their own shadow, and that's not a journey you can walk for them. but you can walk yours. You can stop internalizing their distortions. You can stop confusing their pain with your responsibility. You can begin to see that their behavior, however convincing, was never about you. It was about them, their fear, their story, their fractured sense of self. Here's a soft question to sit with now. What do I gain when I stop trying to understand them and start understanding myself? Not to close your heart, but to redirect your gaze, to reclaim the energy you've spent trying to decode someone who can't even face their own reflection. You're not responsible for their story. You're responsible for your own, and now you get to rewrite it with honesty, with clarity, with compassion, not just for them, but for you. Because gaslighting may have distorted your world, but it never erased your truth. And that truth is still yours. It doesn't happen all at once. There's no dramatic moment, no final confrontation, no applause at the end. The return to reality after gaslighting is quiet, subtle, gentle, like waking from a long, disorienting dream where the logic didn't quite line up, but you played along anyway. And now here in this soft waking, things begin to settle. Shapes sharpen, feelings unnumb, truth stirs beneath the rubble. And the question arises, what if I wasn't wrong? What if I was never wrong? Healing after gaslighting is not about vengeance. It's not about proving them wrong. It's not even about getting the story straight. It's about returning to yourself, piece by piece, thread by thread. It's about picking up the scattered fragments of your memory and rebuilding a timeline that makes sense to you, one that doesn't need anyone else's approval to be valid, one where your body is finally allowed to speak without being silenced, one where your voice belongs. It begins often in the body, in a breath that feels deeper, in a boundary that feels safer, in the choice to pause before apologizing, to sit before explaining, to feel before justifying. You may not even realize it at first. You just start noticing moments where you no longer flinch, where you no longer rush to make others comfortable at the expense of yourself. These are not small moments. They are markers, signs that you are spiraling back toward your center. The spiral is important because healing is not linear. It's not a straight line out of the fog. It circles. You revisit old wounds. You re-encounter old doubts. Sometimes you regress, re-apologize, redoubt your truth. And that's okay because each time around, the spiral expands. You meet the same pain, but with more awareness, more strength, more self-trust. And in that spiraling motion, you are not repeating, you are returning deeper each time. Symbolically, this process is like a spiral staircase in a dark tower. Each step feels similar, but the view slowly changes. You begin to see what you couldn't before. You realize how many versions of yourself you abandoned just to be believed, how many thoughts you swallowed, how many truths you softened. And as you spiral upward or inward, you begin to retrieve those parts. The fiery child, the quiet observer, the truth teller who was silenced, you bring them home one by one. In this space, community becomes sacred. Not necessarily large or loud, just one person who believes you, one space where your version doesn't have to be defended, a journal, a therapist, a friend who says, I believe you, without asking for footnotes. Mirroring is powerful medicine because when you've been gaslit, your reflection has been distorted. And to heal, you need to see your truth mirrored in something or someone that doesn't bend under pressure. And yet, even without external validation, your own knowing is enough. Your own nervous system, once overwhelmed, begins to recalibrate. Your shoulders drop, your breath slows. The silence that once terrified you becomes a sanctuary. You learn to listen again, not to others, but to yourself, to your intuition, to that quiet inner compass that was never truly broken, only buried beneath the noise. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as the process of becoming whole, not perfect, not approved, but whole. And perhaps that's what the spiral is leading you toward. Not a return to who you were before the gaslighting, but a deeper version of who you've always been. One who knows what it feels like to be rewritten and who now chooses deliberately to write herself. There's a paradox at the heart of healing. The deeper you go, the less you need others to see it, the less you need to explain your absence, the less you need to justify your boundaries. Because clarity doesn't shout, it doesn't plead, it just is. And in that clarity, you begin to make choices that once felt impossible. You walk away, you speak up, or you simply stop entertaining stories that don't honor your own. So here is the soft question, the final spiral inward. Who am I now that I've remembered myself? Not the version shaped by someone else's fear, not the one edited for survival, but the version that trusts her memory, trusts her feelings, trusts her pace. That version is not broken. She's not fragile. She's not too much. She's real, and real is enough. You don't need to carry the whole story tonight. You don't need to solve it, confront it, or name every piece. It's enough that you're here, breathing in a space where your truth is no longer on trial. That in this quiet moment, you've allowed yourself to wonder, what if I was never the problem? What if I was always the witness? And in that wondering, something begins to soften. Not everything is fixed, but something inside you feels less alone. You see, healing doesn't always look like triumph. Often it looks like resting after years of trying to be understood. It looks like walking away without needing the last word, like feeling grief and not apologizing for it, like choosing silence not as surrender, but as reclamation. Because the truth has never needed volume, only space. You are not the confused one. You are not the fragile one. You are not the problem. You are the person who noticed the distortion, who carried the weight, who survived the rewriting of your own story and still chose to seek clarity. That's not weakness. That's sacred strength. And tonight, maybe for the first time, you remember that gaslighting didn't erase your truth. It just buried it. And buried things, when tended to gently, can grow back into light. So leave this space gently. No need to rush. Let your body be the compass again. Let your breath be the anchor. Let your knowing be enough. End of script. Drift gently, and I'll meet you in the next thought.